I'm just really honored to introduce Professor Andy Williams to you today, a good friend of this university and a personal friend to many of us here. He's been a delight. Professor Williams has had a broad experience both in the practical world of international affairs as well as in the academic arena. He, after graduating from, I believe it was it Birmingham? Kiel, that's right. It was Kiel University in England. He went to Geneva, Switzerland. While there, I won't tell you what he did in the meantime in Geneva, but it had to do with rock bands. But once in Geneva, he helped found a very prestigious center there called the Center for the Applied Study of International Negotiations. Still exists. He also gained his doctoral degree from the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, and went to work for the University of Kent in Canterbury in 1985. He has continued to do work both in practical things as well as in the academic arena. He has been a consultant to the UN, various organs of the UN, since 1982. He's also a visiting professor at the University of Lille in France. He has a wonderful gift of combining historical analysis with keen analytical skills. And I ought to mention that he taught at BYU in 1991. And when we invited him to come and give this lecture, he wondered why the only time we ever invited him to BYU was when we were at war with Iraq. And Eric Heyer tells me I ought to mention that when he left BYU in 1991, the Pi Sigma Alpha organization gave him an award. They voted him an honorary high priest and wine taster for the political science department. Andy, we're delighted to have you here. Thank you for blessing our lives the way you do.
Thank you, Stan. I think the tone and the style of your presentation explains why I do come back here. I'd like to thank Stan for inviting me. I'd like to thank the Kennedy Center for paying for my airfare. I'd like to thank the FBI for putting me on a watch list, which nearly stopped me getting here. And I'd like to make a small personal tribute to at least one person who's in the audience, who's been a very good friend of mine over the years, as well as Stan. That's Ray Hillam, who is one of the greatest human beings I've ever known, and does some of the finest skiing that my wife has ever seen. I can't say that I'm a great have great skills with that, but I honed them quite a lot up at Ray's cabin in Sundance. It's nice to be back, but I think, of course, it's worth remembering that we are meeting at a time of severe international tension, and I think that the subject of my speech, which may seem a little bit arcane in some ways, is rather appropriate for the kind of things we're thinking about at the moment with our lads in Iraq. 3 of my students are in Number 3 Commando, who are presently encircling Basra, or doing something in Basra. I'm not quite sure from looking at the news what exactly they're up to, but I can assure you it's probably not a very good thing that they're doing, if I know them. They are very brave young men, and I wish them well, and as all of the people from here and other parts of the United States that are fighting what, in my opinion, is an extremely just war. Now, the focus of my talk is on war and peace and the dilemmas that these can pose to open liberal societies, particularly as these wars end. And when I was coming down here with Stan from the airport, from Salt Lake, we talked about this notion of dilemma, and he told me a wonderful anecdote that had happened to him when he was a young student. Stanley was when he was a young student, was one of the class that was being taught by Henry Kissinger, and he'd written in a paper something about problems and dilemmas. And Kissinger wasn't worried about the substance of the paper, but he was worried about the definition of the problem and of the dilemma. And he was summoned in, as I understand it from my memory of our conversation, by the great man, who said to him, "You must understand," I won't try the German accent, "you must understand the difference between a problem and a dilemma." A problem is one that has a solution. A dilemma is a problem that has no solution. And I think that or a problem which has no obvious solution anyway. And war is one of those great dilemmas for liberal societies that has no solution. And what I want to talk about today is how we can come to grips with some of those dilemmas that war gives us. Before I start, though, I'd like to just point out that when I refer to liberals, I'm using it in the British or the continental European sense of the term. I'm not talking about what many Americans would refer to as pinko liberals. I think that's the way it would be put. I think there is a tradition in Western political thought which is actually central to an understanding of the West that goes from people like John Locke through John Stuart Mill and countless others, and ends up with such luminaries as Francis Fukuyama, and even, I would suggest, your president. We're all talking about a liberal discourse. We all talk from the same hymn book of liberalism, as it were, and even though we do refer to some people as being conservatives and liberals in, say, American society, I think there is a central ideology, if you like, that unites us all, and it's that liberalism that I'm talking about. It's a way of life, almost, a way of thinking about the world. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is a little bit about why I'm interested in this question of liberal dilemmas and the ending of wars. And all of my academic life, and particularly since I left this august institution, which had quite a profound effect on my thinking in all sorts of ways, has gone along roughly the following three paths. The first thing is I've asked myself for years now, how do liberal states and societies try and deal with states and opinions of what we now call rogue states? They were called renegades in my book of '94, but rogue states is the word we use nowadays. That is to say, states that seemingly refuse to obey the rules of what is generally referred to as international society. So that's the first question I think we have to ask. Secondly, I've been concerned about how do liberal intellectuals try to come to terms with their own ambivalence about such states and about the need to tolerate difference in international relations, and as well as in national politics, while barely restraining their human desire to eradicate such horrors as Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and now Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Thirdly, how does the subject or field that we call international relations help us to come to terms with the broader questions of life, the desire for peace and the occasional necessity for war, which are of course a feature of all major societies down the ages? And how can that peace that we hope for, be configured to fit in with at least a minimum need for morality and justice, while not allowing itself to be compromised or contaminated by what it sees as other illiberal cultures and societies? So how are you tolerant while at the same time being sort of true to yourself, if you like? And I think BYU is a very good place to think about such dilemmas, a broader human dilemma, if you like. Now, although liberal thinking on peace and war is complex, it draws to a large extent on what is often called the democratic peace idea. And simply put, this asserts that liberal democracies do not go to war with one another. Therefore, to have a peaceful world, we must all be part of a network of liberal democracies, trading with each other, sharing the same values, and banding together against states that deny our values. And of course, the classic philosophical statement of this comes in Immanuel Kant's great work, Perpetual Peace, which is much quoted but hardly ever read, especially by my students. And the idea that he comes up with is this notion that if we are democracies and we band ourselves together in what he calls republics, which is a bit unfortunate if you're a Brit, of course, since we don't have a republic, but I know what he means. We do anyway. We will then be able to create what he calls perpetual peace on the planet. But the vital corollary of this is that illiberal, non-democratic states will always be our potential enemies, or at least competitors. So we have to ask ourselves why we might become involved in wars against such entities, and also what we might hope to achieve at the end of such wars that will inevitably happen, it seems to me. So the focus of my talk and of my thinking at the moment, my book that I'm writing on the ending of wars, is because I believe that we must accept that the logic of the beginning and of the ending of wars is totally linked. You can't separate one off from the other. War aims have no sense unless you have some idea about what you want a post-war situation to look like. Even in non-democratic states, like Hitler's Germany, for example, there was an idea about what Germany wanted the post-war situation to look like after the invasion of Poland. Saddam Hussein had a clear idea about what he wanted to do when he invaded Iraq to recuperate, as he saw it, the lost province of Kuwait. But in liberal democratic societies, a far greater moral case for war has to be made. And we've seen this being discussed widely in the last few weeks, including, especially, indeed, in my country. In 1939, the other Chamberlain, had little problem persuading the British that the continuous affronts to freedom by the Nazis could not be tolerated as he tried to take yet another group of people's freedom in Poland. As the century wore on, liberal democracies found it increasingly necessary to take public opinion with them, as the nature and timing of America's involvement in world wars can be said to demonstrate, or Tony Blair's insistence on the moral importance of a war against Iraq in this year. Sometimes this insistence on morality is a post facto morality and a public pleasing formula, such as the necessity that Lloyd George expressed to build a land fit for heroes after 1918, which is not what he intended to do when he started the First World War, or the New World Order of people like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and latterly George Bush Sr. After the Gulf War of 1991. Increasingly, the case has to be made, and we see it in this war as well, that this war will be part of a project to make the world a better place when it's ended. So there has to be an end product that liberal states wish from war, and that end product, I would assert, has to be a liberal result. So, what does it mean to be a liberal? It's a difficult definition, but I'll take one from John Gray, which I think is very good. He said, liberalism is individualist, it's the first word, in that it asserts the moral primacy of the person against the claims of any other social collectivity. It has to be egalitarian, second key word, insomuch as it confers on all humans the same moral status and denies the relevance to legal or political order of differences in moral worth among human beings. So we're all not only equal, but we have equal moral worth, whether we're an Iraqi or a BYU student or even an Englishman. It has to be universalist, affirming the moral unity of the human species and according secondary importance to specific historical associations and cultural forms. And it has to be meliorist, which is, of course, those of you Latin scholars will know that means improving, in its affirmation of the corrigibility and improvability of all social institutions and political arrangements. So as Richard Bellamy, who's another great theorist of liberalism from my country, says, the strand that most people associate with liberalism is what we call ethical liberalism, within which most prominent British liberals can be included, for example, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and others, as well as many continental philosophers like Kant, Hegel, and their respective followers. The philosophical core of this ethical liberalism is the notion of liberty, a very important thing for Americans, of course, and the belief that it is possible for all members of any society to benefit from this as individuals. Linked to this is a belief in progress, another very dynamic word, which, as Bellamy points out, has theological foundations. Linked to notions of reason and morality, a bedrock of liberal belief emerged by the end of the 19th century that was clear and which differentiated itself from conservative and socialist thought and practice. Liberals have always looked to the carving out of new cultural spaces and creating a new sense of possibility. And I think BYU is a very good example of that in practice. If you're not creating new areas of possibility, then I don't know what you are doing. It seems to me that that's what you're doing. So you could say, are we not all liberals then? In theory, we probably could be said to be, as the West now accepts the basic norms of liberal discourse and action. But this means we also have to come to terms with the inherent contradictions or dilemmas in such stances. I'll just quote a few of the most obvious. Freedom must be constrained in order to continue. How do you protect the weak from the strong in a free society? How do you reconcile freedom, equality, and order? These are all terribly difficult questions which you no doubt all struggle with from day to day, as do I. Equally, we could argue that what one generation of liberals has found congenial is condemned by the next as Victorian values. We had an interesting debate about that in Britain a few years ago. Can you just dismiss such ideas as patriotism, as jingoism, which is a good English word, while denying that it was just such ideals that arguably saved great liberal states like Britain in 1940 from ruin? Is not patriotism in a liberal state the defence of liberal moral values? A wider philosophical critique of liberalism also comes from what many would see as its ludicrous over-optimism. To give you an example of that, Immanuel Kant, in one of his great works, said, in war there are dishonourable stratagems, but some level of trust in the enemy's way of thinking, what he calls Denkungsart, must be preserved even in the midst of war, for otherwise no peace can ever be concluded and the hostilities would become a war of extermination. For Kant that would be inconceivable, for a war of extermination where the destruction of both parties along with all rights is the result would permit perpetual peace to occur only in the vast graveyard of humanity as a whole. Thus such a war, including all means to wage it, must be absolutely prohibited. Now, I don't need to, even if those of you who failed 101 history, which I'm sure is not many of you, will appreciate that the 20th century is absolutely full of examples of such wars of extermination, as indeed has arguably been the centuries before Kant wrote those optimistic words. So, what's all this got to do with international relations? The reason, I take it as axiomatic that the reason why we study international relations is that we are trying to create a world where war will be seen not as the policy, will not be seen as the policy instrument of choice but for change by statesmen and stateswomen. And my book in particular asks if and how we can create what is often referred to as a just and lasting peace after war. It's thus in the tradition of the early fathers of the discipline. It is liberal in inspiration and universalist in aspiration. And I believe that some form of largely peaceful international society is not only possible, but is in existence in many parts of the world, if by no means everywhere. However, I also assume that we have to be very self-critical in our assumptions about liberal values, to acknowledge that they are open to accusations of hypocrisy and self-justification. The realities of power must not be ignored, and it is for power that most wars have been fought. We have to explain that there is no contradiction between freeing the people of Iraq, creating a peaceful situation in the Middle East, and securing global oil supplies, which is often seen as opposites. Where you stand determines what you want as much as what you believe. If hypocrisy, if such it is, consists in not admitting the truth, then the hypocrisy, if such it is, it consists in not admitting the truth. And hence I think Donald Rumsfeld has struck much more of a chord in recent months than Colin Powell. Both these men are singing from the same liberal hymn sheet. The former just says it like it is. So why not, in the words of the arch-realist Ed Luttwak, who's another great American commentator, of course, give war a chance, because he was standing, poor old, that beetle on his head, you know. The answer lies in the very history that realists claim justifies their lack of belief in human progress and goodness and perfectibility. In other words, against liberalism. Since at least the time of Thucydides, students of international relations have been aware that war removes many options once it has been embarked upon. For the great British liberal Gilbert Murray, one of the greatest liberals of all time, one of the worst things about war is that it takes away your freedom and puts you in the region of necessity. You may choose whether or not to fight, but once fighting, your power of choice is gone. But equally, it could be argued, as I think we're hoping we'll argue in a couple of weeks, it could be argued that winning wars provides a great opportunity. Hence Charles Kegley and Gregory Raymond suggest after Winston Churchill, from whence they took the quote, that the problems of victory are more agreeable than those of defeat. He probably said that with a large brandy and a cigar in his hand. They continue by asking the question as to whether this means that victors should therefore be more magnanimous in victory to build trust between adversaries or former adversaries, or harsh to ensure that the enemy's defeat is irreversible, and by eliminating an adversary's capacity to mount a future military challenge. And as they rightly say, throughout the ages, philosophers and theologians, novelists and playwrights, as well as journalists and social scientists, have debated the relative merits of compassionate versus punitive peace settlements. In other words, how wars are going to be ended. This implies that choices that are being made are of a clearly normative character, not just a military character, as well as what might be called the necessities of realpolitik. Indeed, it seems obvious to me that the oft-made distinction between idealist, which is normatively based, and realist, interest-based, here breaks down. In defending itself, any state or system, like the West, is concerned to defend its fundamental belief systems as a central plank of its interest. And although it maybe was said in a slightly different context, Joel Rosenthal sums up this juxtaposition well. Making peace is about making choices, and nearly all of these choices are based on competing underlying principles. So the main concern of my book is in the interaction of such ideas with the global system, indeed on their role in modelling this system and then changing it. War can be said in modern parlance in international relations theory to help constitute liberal thought, and vice versa. Now, liberal institutionalism or internationalism has wrought enormous changes in the world since the end of the 19th century. It's created a framework of international cooperation and a spreading definition of commonly held norms, which do indeed include a purported respect for human rights, non-intervention, anti-imperialism, freedom of commerce and exchange, and religious and political tolerance. It has seen off a raft of sanguinary dictatorships in Nazi Europe and the Soviet Union, and influenced the moderation of many others, including, I would argue, China. However, it has also arguably led to the spread of an economic system of capitalism that many, liberals included, would say is deeply divisive to a global political system, and to a global political system dominated by one liberal state, the United States of America. Equally, liberals have long taken as a core belief the notion of non-intervention in other states' affairs, which is linked to the tolerance of difference, a belief which of course is taken from notions of Christian charity, which I shouldn't need to remind you guys of. Faith, hope and charity, but the greatest of these is charity, St. Paul said. But also from a pragmatic desire to trade and to work through economic tools to reduce tensions and increase integrative processes. This comes out very strongly in the thinking of Woodrow Wilson and nearly all American British liberals, as well as Kant and others I've mentioned. So another key contradiction can be found in the notion of the New World Order, of which I wrote a book about recently, a liberal perspective on global politics since 1918, and one that was exported by force, it mustn't be forgotten. Hence also the notion of humanitarian intervention. At what point, in Michael Walzer's phrase, is the moral conscience of mankind sufficiently shocked to merit intervention in the sovereign affairs of another state? So the overall dilemma, which is dominant in liberalism and international relations of liberalism, is where do we draw the line between the moral imperative to act and the moral imperative to stand back? And I think that one sentence almost sums up the problem about the war in Iraq at the moment. But this doesn't mean, even for those who are against the war in Iraq or any other war, that liberal governments or peoples are necessarily pacifist. In the 19th century, Richard Cobden, another great liberal, espoused, as did John Stuart Mill, the notion that non-intervention in the affairs of other states was usually the wisest course. But they also saw the development of what they called, at the time, a worldwide interdependence growing up and thought in conformity with the changes that have taken place over the entire globe. This was almost prophetic when you think that they were saying it in the 1850s. At the time of the Crimean War in the 1850s, Cobden's famously idiosyncratic view of the world could see no logic in singling out one foreign nation to hate, such as Russia, when Turkey was just as bad. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. He put this down to the inability of the Englishman to, quote, do two things at the same time. It's a bit like President Ford, who couldn't famously chew gum and walk up steps at the same time. For him, all illiberal states were as bad as each other, or rather, as his biographer put it, prejudice against other nations was ungenerous and puerile. Hence, war was to be avoided at all costs, as was intervention in the affairs of other states, with disputes to be worked out by constitutional arrangements with other states where possible. But this logic of leaving illiberal states to their own devices broke down as the nature of war changed and became more violent and destructive in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As even the United States discovered, isolationism was increasingly impossible. It became much more of a question of trying to end wars in such a way as to encourage the dissemination of liberal principles as the harmony of interest, which is a famous early 20th century term. It was not necessary to be warlike to defend liberalism, but there had to be an awareness that it must be defended at some point. The point at which it was is the main question that all liberal politicians have asked ever since, at least since 1914. It is the one that we had to ask about Osama bin Laden, about Saddam Hussein, and maybe tomorrow about Kim Jong-il. Was war to happen over the bombing of embassies, the sinking of ships, or the bombing of New York, or what? So which liberal dilemmas should we really worry about? Now, it seems to me that to reply to this, we have to go back to the very origins of modern liberalism. John Locke, the founding philosophical father of the American Republic. He was working within what could be identified as a political and philosophical space that was both secular and modern, as well as reacting to the political and theological thinkers of his day like Thomas Hobbes. He was, we shouldn't forget, as Michael Doyle says, a liberalism which was revolutionary in its own day, if today his ideas seem utterly commonplace. His views on life, liberty and property became Jefferson's revolutionary life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness and the justification of revolt against all manner of tyrants. The state of nature that Locke talked about was one where such things pertained. A state of war was where they did not. In order to assure that the former is the rule, good government must be instituted, and the inhabitants of such a state will consent to a civil society, a commonwealth. This is what Locke called it. Where good government is not instituted or maintained, rebellion becomes acceptable. Although it would therefore be invidious to draw too many ahistorical lessons from Locke, we can still try and draw out what was significant for us, as the revolutionary nature of liberalism is still with us. It does aim to change the world, and it has succeeded in that better than any other ideology, as Karl Marx pointed out. Locke's thought has provided many of the key ideas upon which the wider militant project of liberalism, both national and international, is still based. For Doyle, the inescapable idea of the state of war and the state of nature was that states that uphold liberal tenets have the right to intervene in any state that does not. Any aggressor state which violates the natural rights of states or individuals makes itself the target of a just war of defence and even of conquest, which goes even further than Donald Rumsfeld, I think. The implications for international law and for the post-Cold War notion of humanitarian intervention are clear. For this doctrine would seemingly justify any action which could be claimed as supporting the principles of life, liberty and property. This goes further than most international lawyers of today would venture, in that it seems to justify preemptive war, which is an expression we're hearing a lot of at the moment, as much a war of self-defence, and also to the notion that the individual responsibility of statesmen, in the sense now envisaged by the International Criminal Court, in that sense as well. Doyle even suggests that Locke gives the perfect basis for going beyond the state of nature for individual states to a wider commonwealth of states and even to a world government. So Locke has got some pretty revolutionary stuff embedded with him. That's another word we're using a lot at the moment, isn't it? Embedded. Another contributory area of IR, and a key dilemma that can be pointed to, lies in the interrelationship between nations in times of war, when the attempt to export the state of nature will lead to the ordinary population being caught in the crossfire between governments of whatever hue. And we've seen this in the newspapers a lot in the last few days, and on CNN. I was watching it this morning. In Michael Walzer's words, in international society, as in Locke's state of nature, every individual member, every belligerent power, claims the right to enforce the law. The content of this right is the same as it is in a domestic society. It is first of all a right of retribution to punish guilty men and women. It is secondly a right of deterrence to protect oneself and others against criminal activity. But as Walzer points out, retribution and deterrence may sit easily with each other in a domestic polity. In peacetime, in war, they do not. It can, in the cases used by Walzer to illustrate his point, lead to innocent people suffering for the fault of others. The case he refers to is where German prisoners of war were shot as a reprisal for the shooting of French civilians during the Second World War. We could enlarge on that by suggesting that liberals have the problem that it is often to make the guilty government of a state suffer for its crimes that the civilians of that state must also be punished, even if they are not guilty, but in many ways also victims of their own government. The logic is clear in many wars that have been waged by liberal states over the last 100 years. We can therefore see that in the foundational thinking of Locke remain many of the dilemmas, or as Locke put it, inconveniences, that haunt liberal states still. Now, how can wars end now? It seems to me, and I'll have to be a bit brief about this because time is pressing on. It seems to me that we can be said to have now a liberal world order where there has been a progressive transformation over the last 100 years from what might be called a realist mindset on war to a liberal one. And this is a process that is by no means ended. To give you some simple examples of this, I'd like to refer to a series of words beginning with R. One of my students made a very rude comment about my book when he noticed that everything began with an R. But I won't go into that in a polite society. Just think about it. The oldest form of war is based on retribution and revenge in victory. And the evidence for this is timeless. You end the war, you parade the slaves through the streets of Rome or whatever, then you throw a few hundred of them off the Tarquin Rock. The Germans tried the same technique in 1940 when they forced the French to sign the armistice in the same railway carriage that the Germans had signed their armistice in 1918. The Germans then blew the railway carriage up to make sure that they could never be put back in the same railway carriage again, as it were. Now, we still talk about retribution and revenge, but we are very much more conscious to avoid triumphalism like that. There's no more throwing people off the Tarquin Rock or blowing up their railway carriages. Even in the taking of Taliban prisoners to Cuba, there's been an uproar from the right and the left, mainly because that looks like triumphalism, I would suggest. How will it affect Muslim public opinion, we cry. Those who in the American administration have tried to say that this is a humane treatment of prisoners who are not prisoners of war, etc., we all know the story, have missed the point. Liberal societies don't like to see anything that looks like them behaving like the people that they most denigrate, Nazis, etc. The second of my R's, which seems to me has had to be modified by this liberal impulse, is restitution. After the First World War, Alsace-Lorraine was restituted to Germany. It was linked with another R, reparation, which I've written about a lot lately. Now, reparation was seen in the interwar period as the cause of the Second World War. The fact that you use this form of, as it were, monetary revenge to damage Germany was seen as the thing that most humiliated Germany, which then led to the rise of Adolf Hitler, etc. Now, reparation is still a word that we use. It's still linked to the notion of restitution, but its modern development in demands from reparation from Iraq, for example, and restitution and now reparation for slavery is a much more liberal version of the same thing. It's an attempt not to get the justice for a government, but to get justice for individuals. It's got this idea, liberal idea, that individuals should be given restitution in a way that is much more clear than was the case after, say, 1918. Another R, restraint. The reason why I think this is an important word to use at ending wars is because many wars, including ones in the last decade, have ended up with restraint being put on semi-defeated countries. The sanctions regime which was imposed on Iraq was a form of restraint, no-fly zones and all the rest of it. What it starts as an idea is the idea of blockade. So during the First World War, the British killed very large numbers of Germans and caused the collapse of the German state, as much by the policy of stopping food getting into Germany as by the actions on the Western Front. That is certainly the view of the British Navy, the admiral in charge of the British Navy of the time. What we've got now is a restraint with a distinctly much more liberal flavour. We do take seriously the problem that this kills Iraqi children and all the rest of it, even if you can say, well, it wasn't actually down to the sanctions, it was down to Saddam Hussein, which of course is the line pursued by both the American and British governments. The installation, it is all intended to bring about the installation of liberal governments and to extend the zone of the democratic peace. And the reason why we are now at war with Iraq, I would submit, is because that policy of restraint did not prove to be strong enough to the task in hand. Another R which I think we've got to think about, and this is where I think liberalism has really demonstrated its force, is that we are now thinking far more in terms of, after the war has ended, in terms of reconciliation as a term which previously didn't have any kind of take in the thinking about war and peace. And this is because we are trying to create self-sustaining peace where there's no need for maintenance by force after the battle has ended. The liberal dilemma here is that in most recent wars, two logics are at play, that of justice and that of peace. If you want peace, then a demand for justice can get in the way. How do you relativize and reconcile the two? We can all agree with Geoffrey Robertson, which I believe is one of your main course books on courses like this, that crimes against humanity are by definition unforgivable, but we still have to deal with war criminals if we want peace. However, as American diplomat Richard Holbrooke put it after the Dayton Agreement that ended the war in Bosnia, when he was asked about Milosevic's involvement in war crimes, he said, "It's not my role to make a judgment. You can't make peace without President Milosevic." This was flatly contradicted almost the next week by the then President of the International Tribunal on War Crimes in Bosnia, Justice Richard Goldstone, who said, "These are matters that will not affect the decisions we make. We are interested in building a body of legal evidence regardless of the political consequences." So by the time of the Dayton Agreement in 1995, it had come to the point where there could not be a separation of justice and peace. The State Department spokesman Nicholas Burns claimed there is no need for a trade-off between the two. But Roger Cohen of the New York Times was surely right when he said, "By most estimates, no semblance of justice can be done in Bosnia. If peace is now built, it will be done on the basis of enormous shifts of population and widespread killings." Ethical problems involved in these choices are enormous and at the heart of all thinking about politics, not just international politics. As Max Weber put it 100 years ago, can there be an ethic of ultimate ends or conviction, an uncompromising adhesion to a set of values and ideals, or do we have to settle for an ethic of responsibility which acknowledges the need to be guided in one's political conduct by an awareness of what is practically possible? One can lead to the certainty of the Gulag or even fundamentalism, the other to endless compromise. So what can we say about these dilemmas? A few points that I want to make. Firstly, it is notable that the majority of the horrors of the 20th century have been committed by states either against their own population or against a generalized population that was deemed to merit persecution, such as the Jews. They have all been committed by organized and efficient state structures, not one of which I would argue can be called a liberal state. Liberal states won 2 world wars and a Cold War against such totalitarian states, and their settled norms now make up the essential of what passes for rules in the international community. Secondly, since the end of the Cold War, the Charter of the United Nations is being increasingly interpreted to implement a norm of humanitarian intervention. This includes the use and extension of the idea of war crimes tribunals, and it includes the putting on trial before these bodies of heads of state for the first time, Slobodan Milosevic being the first to appear in July 2001. And the real impetus of the inauguration of these tribunals in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, etc., has been a liberal impulse. Now, if you're a realist, you would say, as Gary Jonathan Bass puts it, to realists, international moralizing is mystifying. as is the punishing of war criminals. And he quotes E.H. Carr, who says, "Politics are not a function of ethics, but ethics of politics. You do whatever is necessary to win. It is victor's justice, in other words, would say a realist." Liberals believe otherwise. For them it makes a difference who the victors are. As Bass says, we are at the beginning of an age in which it will be insisted that the same standards of conduct and responsibility for wrong shall be observed among nations and their governments that are observed among the individual citizens of civilized states. This is the necessary spreading of norms of decent conduct, and these norms are liberal. And it's worth noting that all war crimes tribunals have been pursued by liberal states. First World War, Leipzig, Constantinople, Nuremberg, Tokyo, and now The Hague. So, could or should liberal logic prevail in this way of thinking about war and peace? A few tentative thinkings to go along with this. Liberals are among the major advocates of peace with justice and reconciliation after all wars. But even that justice, for example that against Germany after 1945 or 1918, rather looked like the victors were defying the wrongdoers. Although it would be absurd to make a moral equation between the bombing of Germany or Japan carried out with a clear war aim of shortening the war against aggressive states, would it be entirely wrong to say that there was liberal guilt as well in that war? The Russian army, allied to the liberal states, conducted the Katyn massacres of Polish officers in 1941, not the Wehrmacht or the German SS. War crimes were committed by allied troops. The summary execution of troops after D-Day, for example, by British and American troops. SS troops were killed by these people. The Allied bombing campaign of Germany has now been reappraised, and not without some guilt being attributed to the bombers, many of whom were American and British, including some of my relatives who never came back. Secondly, the emergence of the system of international justice from the early beginnings is one that has put states on trial in the process, but has seen a recent development in the International Criminal Court which is putting individuals on trial. That is surely a liberal achievement. But the appeal of these bodies, is the appeal of these bodies truly universal, or does it not rather again show that the power of those who can exercise it has a tendency to overcome the objections of those who cannot? Thirdly, many states now face democratization and transition to facilitate reconstruction and development, for example. So is the only logic of that the use of external pressure, as in the former Yugoslavia or Germany in 1945, etc., the logic of the winners? What does this do to the disempowered local need for justice? Milosevic killed just as many Serbs as he did Croats or Muslims by his actions. To deny them justice will leave a sullen resentment, one that cannot be stimulated as it was in it could be stimulated rather as it was in the 1930s by a new autocrat in Serbia. If that's the case, then the arguments of President Kostunica that Serbs need to try Milosevic, not The Hague, has much to commend it. A successful attempt to extradite Milosevic, who was democratically elected to run ruler in Serbia, has not only served to underline the collective guilt of Serbs, while not really bringing about the democratic transition that the international community desires. As with Germany in 1945, we would be left with the choice, peace or justice, or rather peace and partial justice. It is surely better that Milosevic be tried in his own country, and that this helps the internal reconciliation of Serbs, than that what we have seen, which is a spectacle of justice, or it can hardly be called an unbiased trial, that then makes internal Serb reconciliation very much more difficult. Zoran Dinčić, I think, has been killed, at least partly, because of his decision to send Milosevic to The Hague, and that has been an immensely damaging thing for Serbs as well as the rest of us Europeans. However, where would that leave all the non-Serbs for whose suffering and deaths Milosevic is allegedly responsible? The analogy might be made that it would be better to jail Al Capone for tax fraud when that was the least of his crimes. The very fact that he is shown to be sometimes subject to the law was better than he should always seem to be above it. No punishment can repay Milosevic for his crimes, but convicting him in Belgrade would have had a far more positive effect where it is most intended. Lastly, and to return to the first premise of these concluding remarks, it could be argued the idea of the dispensing of justice by the international community is still a very Western liberal idea. There's not much sign that the idea has caught on outside the narrow confines of Western states and liberal governments. The view among most Yugoslavs of all ethnic groups is that they are as much victimized as victimizers, and there's no real willingness to accept global guilt and to make restitution. On the other hand, there is the willingness, and much more widely than the West, for reconciliation. Now, just to end on a few sort of university-type notes. A true believer in liberal values would argue that the reason that we doubt liberal solutions to the problem of war is that liberalism is a self-reflective ideology, constantly carping about itself and ready to change. I would say it's an ideology for grown-ups. It embraces its dilemmas and it does not ignore them. So you get liberals attacking the war against Iraq while simultaneously supporting its aims. You get liberals inhabiting European, American and other universities and criticising and checking the behaviour of their governments. They can even agree to let their own states' behaviour be subject to the scrutiny of regional or international criminal courts. And yet liberals are confused about their own destiny, deeply worried by criticism, as troubled as any Reformation cleric that their God is not perhaps on their side or looking with approval at their actions. It is this auto-ambivalence that gives realists and Marxists such an open target and a field day with all liberals, but also what makes liberalism such a vibrant and adaptable ideology. And in all this I have one major guiding sensibility, and this is summed up, I think, by John Kenneth Galbraith. He said, "Courage is required of the man who, when things are good, says so. Historians reduce in crucifying the false prophet of the millennium. They never dwell on the mistake of the man who wrongly predicted Armageddon." In other words, I want to see the glass as half full, not as always half empty. In this I'm a true liberal and an eternal optimist. That's possibly why I keep coming back to BYU. And I'd like to end with a quote from Deborah Orr in The Independent of 26 December after the 9/11 events, where she quotes her lecturer brother. "Others have lived through terrible times, and, quote, they were created in an environment in which the future was cloudy as ours, perhaps cloudier still, in a time and a place where death was far more proximate," unquote. He, that's to say her brother, thus reminds himself and every lecturer and student, and this of every university, including mine, that we cannot ignore the terrible events of the world. We have to confront them and turn them to our advantage. As Deborah Orr's brother reminds us, and her, and all of us, by aggravating the permanent human situation so that we can no longer ignore it, war asks us to be just a little bit clearer about what we are doing and why. Thank you.